so I'm in trouble. I've written too much. And I've had to cut bits out. Dara has got electronic copies of my talk, and I've referenced a lot of my sources and justified what I'm saying. So if anybody's really that interested, I hope that Dara can make these files available online. He asked me to come, and I think what he really wanted me to talk about was the question of regulation or not regulation, which is facing Spain and probably other countries as well. So that's what I'm here to talk about. The first talk I'd sort of entitled Why Political Naivety Might Be Our Worst Enemy. And the second talk, which I shall read straight on to now, was about law and liberty. So I'd better get on with it, otherwise I'll run out of time. The political philosopher Edmund Burke in 1784 said, the people never give up their liberty, but under some delusion. It's the nature and intent of that delusion which I want to explore in this talk, in the hope of better enabling us to know what it might be worthwhile to attempt to do to improve conditions for us as home educators, and what might be hopeless action or worse. Please bear with me if what follows does not at first seem to have much to do with home education. I promise I will try to justify its inclusion. The state is the principal manufacturer of mass delusion, and almost everything it does has this quality of appearing to be one thing, but really being another, usually opposite thing. Parliaments are really now reduced to little more than pantomimes, staged to entertain us with the illusion of sovereign government we voted for, as it simply dresses up and puts into place the directives of global governance, to which it is signed up and legally committed to. Much of what passes for national policy can be found in the EC Lisbon 10-year strategies and in the UN Agenda 21, for example, but these are not the only sources. There's a vast, bewildering world of more institutions than it is possible to imagine, let alone remember out there, all dedicated to expertly determining for us how we shall all live and what we will think and believe and even feel about it all. Web surf through this morass sometime if you have never done so, and you'll begin to understand your intended place in the totally managed world. Only the other day, I stumbled across the International Union of Local Authorities, which has been going for 98 years. It's just amazed me. If you've ever wondered how local government in one country can manage to oppress home educators in seemingly identical ways, with identical prejudices and modus operandi, then here is a contender for one efficient mechanism for globalizing bad practice. Amusingly, in an attempt to resource a link to this organization, I fell over another couple in the same field before finding my way back to this one. One of them cheerfully informed me that half the legislation affecting local government came from the EEC. So even the institutions of local and national government itself, as we're taught to understand them, are mostly a delusion. The real power and planning happens elsewhere behind the scenes, and national government is reduced now to puppet status the world over. One world government is with us already, and this is no conspiracy theory. As G. Edward Griffin points out, very few major events of the past have occurred in the absence of conspiracies. To think that our modern age must be an exception is not rational. If we don't know this, then perhaps our own educations in history have been somewhat lacking. The use of this term as ridicule of critics of the state is understandable as a good example of how what passed for our own thoughts are handed to us by the state. Deception is a state of mind, and the mind of the state, wrote James Angleton, head of counterintelligence at the CIA from 1954 to 1974. And he was in a position to know, I suppose. It's an indefensible and demonstrable nonsense to apply the term conspiracy theory to what can be so easily demonstrated to be the case from the very architects themselves. Aldous Huxley knew what he was writing about in Brave New World because his whole family were world controller class and intelligentsia. His fictional director of the Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Centre explains it. At last, the child's mind is these suggestions, and the sum of the suggestions is the child's mind, and not the child's mind only, the adult's mind too, all his life long, the mind that judges and desires and decides, made up of these suggestions. But all these suggestions are our suggestions, suggestions from the state. Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's older brother, was the first director of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. He wrote its mission statement in 1946, in which he said, "In its educational program, it can stress the ultimate need for world political unity and familiarize all peoples with the implications of the transfer of full sovereignty from separate nations to a world organization." It's quite something, isn't it? This is a founding document of UNESCO and the purpose of the UN. It is not possible to reconcile this statement with fighting for king and country, which was therefore a con. These being slated for obsolescence even as the war was being fought, and indeed long before that. The UN and its various agencies, through its 1,298 treaties that national governments are signed up to implementing in domestic law, is the global governance. And its founding documents, as above, and other sources reveal that this was always its mission. Still on the subject of state deception, and on a truly audacious scale scarcely grasped today, is the export to Britain, and I expect other countries as well, I don't know, of the American charter school model of pretended local control over education. Charlotte Iserby, a one-time Federal Education Department insider turned whistleblower, is who you need to read in order to understand this new con. She's written a book entitled The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, in which she accesses her impressive archive of documents she herself sneaked out of the department, in which the real agendas were revealed. This is online. Localism in all its forms, in fact, is not just in education, is a con, masking its opposite, stronger centralized control. In England, legislation is and has been going through its speed to put in place a new possibility, amongst other things, for dealing with the problem of people like us escaping. There is currently an intention to set up government-funded, free, private, online courses aimed at home educators under this charter school movement. It has had the cheek to steal the name of the free schools it suppressed to give them that fake credential. It is to be hoped they would not get away with such an insult to Spain, but how well do you know your own history? So while our government is distracting some of us, continuing the facade of pretending to be our friends and tinkering with guidelines, documents, this runaway train is heading for us and set to take most of us out. If you're not familiar with the story of the wild, free and fierce Okefenokee swamp pigs, which were lured by free grain as a fence was very slowly constructed around them, that they were free to come and go through until they weren't, and were all taken to market, then this is easy to find online. And it's a good metaphor, I think, for how the problem of Britain's escapees are to be rounded up. The easier to then persecute a much smaller number of refuseniks, and especially at a time when the government is robbing us and impovering us impoverishing us, to an extent likely to make us hungry enough to go for their free grain. The legislative body itself will not shrink from lying about what the law is. And the biggest lie about education throughout the world is that school is compulsory, when mostly it is education that is. These duplicitous acts should be borne in mind if contemplating seeking legislation from government. If you can't do what Orwell called doublethink yourself in order to anticipate what government will get out of what you want from it, then you'd be better not talking to them at all, probably, for everyone's sake. Only the other day I read a journalist commenting in the thoughtful online Scottish Review that he had personally witnessed, this is a quote, "Civil servants exquisitely craft sentences that have at least 7 different meanings, ambiguity at its highest. And why do they do it? In order to keep as many interests on board as possible." I can certainly recognise that this is the way our government writes, although I may still be missing something in not being able to count as high as 7 usually. Home educators in Britain are familiar with government guideline documents and even statute itself, which is written in this way, to be all things to all people, despite the unavoidability of embodying impossible contradictions in order to do so. Doublethink. The global education system turns out to be designed from its inception to prevent true education, or at least bias it so grossly as to effectively rob us all of our own minds, through kindergarten to PhD. I wrote more about that, but I didn't have time to include it as a justification of that possibly provocative comment. It's in the file, if anybody wants it. The institution of state compulsion schooling was born in its current form in the 18th century absolutist monarchies of Prussia and Austria to serve those totalitarian regimes, which were failing in their control over the hearts and minds and bodies of its subject people, largely through failing to successfully suppress literacy, which may come as a surprise. The model it created was so successful that the world flocked to Prussia and brought it back to their own countries. In Spain, 100 years later, at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, there was civil unrest in which the Catholic Church schools, which could be quite brutal, and the monarchy were equally hated and precipitating revolt. Just as in Prussia and Austria a century earlier, where the lower orders, as they like to call us back then, were turning their backs on official schooling, which did not teach literacy, and favouring instead their own backstreet schools, as they were known, which did. So there was revolt in Spain against the 50 to 70% illiteracy then. Francisco Ferrer founded the first free school, which, despite his own incarceration for a year without trial and subsequent state murder without trial by firing squad, spawned a school movement that finds its few unsuppressed remnants today in the Sudbury Valley schools in America, in Summerhill in England, which our government recently unsuccessfully tried to shut down, and a handful of others dotted around the world. Ferrer's free schools were schools in which children's own agendas were not banished, in which there was no compulsion, where the pupils and staff democratically ran the school, and if a teacher punished a pupil, it earned them permanent dismissal. In one account I read, I don't know if it was reliable, there's a lot about Ferrer online, some of it badly written, some of it much better. It was claimed that at their peak in the early 20th century, more children attended the free schools than the state schools. All the above is by way of trying to paint a picture from history which might usefully inform us about now. Because like 18th century Prussia and 19th century Spain, or England, which maintained a paper tax known at the time as a knowledge tax, along with the introduction of state schooling, power was in trouble and in danger of losing its grip fatally for it. And it is again today. I don't know, if anybody, how many people realise this, but this is the other face of seemingly an omnipotent power that's energetically pursuing so much policy and lawmaking that it can in fact be seen as a sign of real trouble that it's in. And this is largely due to the ICT revolution, rendering its old factory schooling system obsolete and an anachronism. The growing number of home educators discovering and exercising their suppressed freedoms is a symptom of that, and a dangerous one potentially for power. This is why we're suddenly such an obsession for government the world over. As I understand it, in Spain, as in Britain, education is compulsory, but school is not. And the law in both countries does not limit how education is to happen. Therefore, this is our liberty, our freedom to choose. And this is also supposedly guaranteed in human rights legislation. What we can see around the world in nearly every country are basically one of two strategies operating to deal with this threat to absolutism: outright suppression and integration. Both spell death to the self-owned and directed life, where the learner is in charge of their own learning and they're employed on a whatever works basis, depending on how established and assertive home educators are in a country. Integration of home education into the state education system is another form of death because, as John Taylor Gatto rhetorically asks in a question which formed the title of one of his early essays, why fix a system designed to destroy individual thought? I'm not a lawyer. I have no legal training or qualifications. I edited legal guidelines once, over 10 years ago, to give to local education authorities about the law relating to home education, but that's about it. That's how I learned. And it's widely recognised in the UK that home educators are not lawyers. Even specialists in education law may know the law better, and many solicitors have been successfully briefed by unqualified home educators. In attempting to better understand the law in Spain and its different relationship of semi-autonomous regions to national government and the relationship of national education law to regional education law, I found that my particular questions about this relationship, such questions as can the regions legally impose schooling, effectively banning home education when national law only prescribes education, not schooling, were not being answered. I concluded that it was hopeless for me to attempt a good enough understanding of the legal landscape here, and that I'd better confine my observations to general principles learned from our English experience and hope that they may be of some value. I also found myself wondering, as I read, if Spanish home educators might still need to learn more about the law than seemed evident to me. What I can say is that until we were blessed with the wholehearted engagement of a home educating barrister in England, our knowledge of the law, while basically mostly correct, was perhaps also rudimentary, and in some respects, and certainly not as nuanced as it was enabled to become through this expert help. The idea that home education, or anything else for that matter, can be neither legal nor illegal seemed like an error to me. I'm still not sure whether I've misunderstood this, but anyway. As does the idea of un vacuo legal, sorry for the pronunciation, which I take to mean a legal vacuum, meaning the law is silent about the activity in question. Where the law is silent about something, this is where our liberty resides. If something is not unlawful, then it is by default lawful. And there is liberty to pursue the thing in any way one chooses, so long as it as doing so does not break other laws as a consequence. To take the English legal situation, parents are under a legal obligation to ensure suitable education is received. These are the words in the statute. And suitable is defined in the statute as efficient, full-time, suitable to age, ability, aptitude, and any special educational needs. This is to be ensured by means of regular attendance at school or otherwise. Those wonderful two words, or otherwise, are as far as the law goes. It does not go on to specify those other ways. So long as we meet the criteria of suitable, as it's minimally defined in the statute, we can do what we like, and we do. The term home education, homeschooling, or anything similar meaning that is not used in the statute. It is by default one possible legal means to meet the parental obligation to ensure suitable education is received. Where the law does not regulate, neither can government nor local authority. It cannot lawfully fill that vacuum the phrase almost invites, and there can be no doubt that the activity is lawful if it is not proscribed in law. Welfare laws require parents to adequately feed and clothe and shelter their children, but they do not specify a diet, a minimum standard of clothing or dwelling. So long as these don't appear to be insufficient to ensure the general welfare of the child, parents are left to get on with it. Despite schools being the largest economic sector on earth, with all the vested interests and elite agendas determining it, school in most countries remains merely one of the ways to provide an education, that's all. Or it should do. And that, as I understand it, is how matters should be in both our countries, with the choice left to parents who should only come to the attention of the authorities if, in the words of the English statute, it appears that a child is not receiving a suitable education. Only then are they put on inquiry for breach of the general law. But sadly, we all know that in both our countries, life is not as it should be, and the authorities tend to be far more intrusive than their powers lawfully allow. And that a fight through the courts, which is usually successful here, I read, may be necessary to obtain the law. The problem would therefore seem to be essentially one of either simple ignorance of the law by local enforcement officers or willful misunderstanding of the law, resulting in unlawful harassment of law-abiding parents. As I previously argued, the institution of forced state schooling is built on lies and is vulnerable to exposure to the truth that it is not needed in order to produce productive, well-socialized adults. This is reason enough to explain its hostility. Forcing you to do what you don't want to do or falsely imprisoning you is bullying, and the system, therefore, is a bully. It seems to me that it would be a grave mistake to effectively appease the bully by blurring the issue of whether it has the law on its side where it does not, by asking it to specifically legislate to enable home education to be practiced. I appreciate that that situation is different in different countries, of course. In England, home educators simply asserted the right as a reasonable interpretation of the or otherwise clause by showing that it met the suitable criteria for an education. There was an amusing incident in the early 1950s, in an early 1950s court case where an LEA, Local Education Authority, was attempting to prosecute a home educator for not obeying their school attendance order and sending her children to school. The wretched official in the LEA, as he was running out of arguments, complained bitterly that Parliament never envisaged a Mrs. Baker. There has never been a Mrs. Baker. Well, it was probably true that Parliament never intended the non-aristocracy to notice that there really can be one law for the rich and another for the rest, but only if the rest can be kept ignorant of the law. sadly fooling most of the people for most of their lives with a non-existent obligation to send one's child to school has been only too successful. If the state is hostile to home education, which it is, because it sees it as a form of leakage or escape from its absolutist ambitions for the totally planned society, and you can't have a planned society if you have individuals that are living their own lives by their own lights. It's important to realize that. And if that state is a consummate deceiver with a hidden workforce, predictable consumer moulding agenda, which it is, then it is surely neither realistic to expect its regulation of home education not to be subverted to these system ends, nor to hope for further improvement once regulation has been obtained. Indeed, gradualism or incrementalism, a process of slow social change that takes the long view and accepts 2 steps forward and 1 step back, the way outlined by the English Fabian Society, which of course is now international like everything else, and the principal modus operandi of bringing about change will be put to work by government in the opposite direction from the one we desire to go in. Don't give them the opportunity to get started on the destruction of this essential liberty wherever they haven't already usurped it. State absolutism achieved in education is a truly frightening and evil thing. In Germany, where this system was born in absolutism to more efficiently serve it, they have more or less achieved that. The state, in effect, defines home education as child abuse. And there is almost no one who has not been schooled to be able to know from their own experience the truth of the matter. It is not only okay to snatch children from their beds in the middle of the night, to foster them to strangers and not tell their loving parents where they are. It's their duty to do so, to protect them from such parents. Mass psychosis, I call it. Our experience of dealing with our own increasingly hostile government in England shows that it is possible to defend the primary legislation that grants arguably good enough freedom, for now at least, to successfully prevent the government from making us apply for licenses to educate our children ourselves, which is what compulsory registration would mean. It is even possible to make the government admit in writing, as it did in the last guidelines document it issued in 2007. It said, "Local authorities have no statutory duties in relation to monitoring the quality of home education on a routine basis." This was a suggestion from us for a change, not a suggestion from the state. So, if at all possible, obtain from government statements confirming the legality of home education, the non-existence of statutory duties to monitor or whatever, in preference to actually changing the law to say these things, because in the former scenario you still have your liberty under the law, plus this protection from local despotism of a government telling them what the law means. I suspect the suggestion from the Spanish Constitutional Court in 2010 to write enabling legislation for alternative ways to educate, including home education, might come under Huxley's suggestions from the state. I don't know. If there's a possibility that the lack of prescription can be understood as liberty in this aspect of life, and a statement made by government to that effect, then this would be infinitely preferable to loss of that liberty. The French political economist Frédéric Bastiat, not sure of the pronunciation, around 1850, stressed the importance of the law embodying justice, because without that it had no natural legitimacy. Why would anybody want it? Justice should be the only business of law, he maintained, but he also stressed that justice is achieved not by legislating for it, but by legislating to prevent injustice. Law, he said, should be negative, not positive, or by implication enabling. Under his system of law, if you can overlook the sin of coercing education in the first place, within that context in England, we have negative law protecting our liberty, not regulation ensuring we comply by a system of licensing and inspections. It only seems possible to lobby government either for what it already wants you to lobby it for and has brainwashed us into doing, or if it's something that isn't wanted but you're persistent enough, it will find ways to appear to give you what you want or the hope of eventually getting it in order to keep government by consent going. Only for as long as it can keep you talking can it claim its fake democratic listening credentials. So if there's to be talk, make that talk count for something, not just treading water. Only the government benefits from that as it continues to advance against you on other fronts. Distraction burglary is one of their ways. Credibly threaten to break off talks that are going nowhere, or refuse cosy chats in their corridors of power that have no clear purpose or prior shared agenda. Let them know there's a line they can cross, that if they cross it, then they risk losing this constituency and their faked appearance of listening, which is so important to them. Be aware, for example, that consultations are not consultations at all. They're SATs, standard assessment tests, to determine how well or how poorly we have understood what it wants us on board with, and provides them, therefore, with useful intelligence as to any problems the prior agenda may run into and how best to spin the PR. With this in mind, it is nonetheless possible to respond to their rigged exercises on your own terms. Colluding with trying to make a silk purse out of their sow's ear, to use an English expression, is doomed to failure as the original agenda gains its appearance of consent thereby. Destructively testing their love is better than imagining we have to be good to avoid being punished. That's just a projection from unhappy childhood. It's 3 decades since the Westminster government first expressed a desire to force home educators to register with local government. They tried to sneak through withholding deregistration from schools only this year, hoping we wouldn't notice, and then dropped it like a hot potato the minute they got caught. It was comical. Despite such telling behaviours, our common fear is that they will just bulldoze something unwanted through, regardless of our feelings about it. But brute force, direct head-on confrontation like that never seems to get closer than threat. And had they succeeded, they must have known that they would have been pushing us too far and into civil disobedience territory. Such acts of domestic terrorism by our own government upon us serve, they hope, to make us grateful for lesser attrition. But we do not have to be so manipulable. Withdrawing consent, then, would seem like a way to neutralise the preferred way of working of government, which is to keep you on board while tricking you into believing you might be getting somewhere and obtaining what you want. Find ways to say no to it that you personally feel able to do. Easier said than done, I know, but just saying it on publicly accessible forums will rattle them and even provide good entertainment sometimes in their response, which is another story I don't have time for now. They don't want their games exposed. A change of intolerable scoundrels every 5 years serves to keep the illusions of democracy going, while the real agenda, along with the new despots, con artists and honest dupes, enjoys a honeymoon period as it carries on without a pause. Had the new legislation in 2010 succeeded, then it would almost certainly have moved into the territory of open defiance of the measures, such as Australian home educators demonstrate, by recognising that there is the permissive and non-permissive routes into home education. In Australia, breaking the law has a recognised name for a choice. In Queensland alone, between 7,000 and 11,000 children are home educated by otherwise law-abiding people who will not stomach this imposition because they know it's wrong. A dangerous precedent for any government to set, surely, educating its citizens on the limits to its own power. Government seeks legitimacy and consent, and this is so deeply embedded now in the way it works that modern government will go to extraordinary lengths, including removing hated impositions like the children's database or ID cards in England, which this new administration did, in order not to suffer widespread civil disobedience. We are far from being as powerless as the monolith of government would like us to believe is the case. Negotiating with government is never legitimate if it results in negotiating away liberties, because they're not yours to concede and belong to everyone and to future generations. You'll be rightly hated and vilified if you do this, and what's more, you will have yourself become part of illegitimate government. Pragmatic ideas of this is the best we can get may or may not be self-fulfilling prophecies. I don't know how you could know. If your approach is of this fatalistic kind, and this is fatalism, then this is what you'll get, and so will our children and their children, and they might not thank you for it. We're not in the enviable position, I'm nearly finished now. We're not in the enviable position of being able to choose a safe and easy way to protect our children from such an exploitative and abusive system. There are also obvious limits to the potential for direct civil disobedience if it empowers state kidnap of our children by way of response. But that does not mean we're powerless and can do nothing because of this exploitable vulnerability. While the law remains on our side where it does, it's vital to keep it that way. And the law-breaking authorities and government itself can be called to account for its law-breaking and misrepresentation. Better to be on the right side of good enough law and the authorities on the wrong side of it than to end up on the wrong side of bad law. No one wants to have to fight in order to enjoy liberty, of course, but there is a much worse scenario.